Why stability started failing upward. Everything looked solid. Markets were calm. Systems were holding. Losses were rare, contained, almost reassuring. And yet beneath that smooth surface, something was quietly breaking. Stability itself had begun producing the very fragility it was meant to prevent. London prized stability above all else. Predictable markets attracted capital. Consistent rules built confidence. Crises were treated as failures to be eliminated, not signals to be studied. The institutional culture of the city rewarded those who maintained order and punished those who acknowledged uncertainty, creating an environment where the appearance of control was valued more highly than the honest assessment of risk. Over time, the city learned how to suppress volatility so effectively that calm became the default expectation. The success of the suppression was so complete that it changed the psychology of every participant in the system, replacing a healthy respect for uncertainty with a dangerous assumption that uncertainty had been permanently tamed. To understand why this mattered, we need to return to a moment when protection became policy. Safeguards multiplied, risk was smoothed, losses were absorbed before they could spread. Each intervention made the system appear safer than before. The cumulative effect was a financial environment in which the natural feedback mechanisms of failure had been systematically dismantled, replaced by institutional responses that preserved calm at the cost of information. Participants grew accustomed to rescue, adjustment, and correction. Stability stopped being a goal and became an assumption. The reveal emerged slowly. As shocks disappeared, caution followed. Participants increased exposure, trusting that safeguards would hold. Complexity grew inside the calm. Connections multiplied beneath the surface. Stability encouraged scale, and scale amplified dependence. The relationship between safety and risk inverted. The safer the environment appeared, the more risk participants were willing to take, and the more risk they took, the more fragile the system became, even as its surface remained perfectly calm. What looked like strength was actually compression. Pressure was no longer released through small failures. It accumulated. Minor risks were postponed, not removed. The system grew quieter, but also tighter. London was building a world where failure had nowhere to go, and once stability stopped allowing weakness to surface, the city would discover what happens when pressure can only move in one direction. The answer, as London would learn, was that pressure does not disappear when it is suppressed. It migrates, concentrates, and waits for the one moment when suppression fails. As stability became expected, behavior across the city shifted in subtle but dangerous ways. Participants stopped asking whether systems could fail. They asked only how much they could rely on them. Risk was no longer avoided. It was layered, distributed, and quietly expanded. Institutions optimized for calm. Models were tuned to recent history. Stress, scenarios assumed recovery, would arrive quickly. Capital buffers shrank relative to confidence. When nothing broke, restraint felt unnecessary. Success reinforced belief that stability was permanent. The feedback loop was seductive. Each year without crisis made the next year's risk-taking seem more reasonable, and the absence of consequences became the strongest argument for continuing to expand. This produced a paradox. The safer the system appeared, the more fragile it became. With volatility suppressed, signals disappeared. Small warnings that once prompted correction were absorbed silently. Pressure built invisibly, hidden by smooth outcomes. Interdependence deepened. Firms relied on the same safeguards. Strategies converged. Diversity of approach faded as everyone trusted the same protections. The city grew synchronized not by coordination, but by shared assumptions of safety. The uniformity that felt like consensus was actually a concentration of risk. Because when everyone makes the same bet, the system has no internal diversity to absorb losses when that bet fails. Tension emerged when rare disturbances occurred. Instead of correcting behavior, they were neutralized quickly. Each intervention confirmed expectations. Stability was preserved, but learning was delayed. Risk migrated inward, concentrating beneath layers of calm. London was no longer managing uncertainty. It was deferring it. And with every postponed failure, the system became more sensitive to the one it could no longer avoid. The breaking point arrived quietly, disguised as normality. Nothing dramatic failed at first. No single institution collapsed. Instead, a small disruption spread farther than expected, slipping through safeguards designed for exactly that purpose. Stability did not absorb the shock. It redirected it upward. Participants reacted with confidence at first. Protections activated. Losses were smoothed. But each layer of protection pushed stress higher into the system, concentrating it where failure would matter most. What could not fail locally began threatening the whole. The conflict emerged when safeguards started working against one another. Interventions overlapped. Signals blurred. No one could tell whether conditions were genuinely improving or merely being postponed again. Decisions relied on stability that was no longer organic, but engineered. Markets grew brittle. Minor changes triggered outsized reactions. Liquidity thinned where calm had once been deepest. The system had become so sensitive to disruption that the very tools designed to preserve stability were now amplifying the smallest disturbances. The absence of small failures meant no one knew where limits truly lay. Stability had removed feedback. The system was flying blind, navigating by instruments calibrated to conditions that no longer existed. Institutions faced an uncomfortable realization. By preventing loss at every level, they had eliminated resilience. The system had learned how to survive everything except disruption. When pressure finally surfaced, it had nowhere left to go. The city watch's confidence cracked not from chaos, but from orders stretched too far. Stability, once a shield, now amplified danger. London was forced to confront a paradox it had created. When failure is forbidden below, it eventually arrives above, larger, faster, and far more destructive than anything it replaced. The resolution required London to rethink what stability was supposed to do. The city stopped treating calm as proof of health and began treating it as a condition that needed release. Small failures were no longer feared. They were welcomed as information. Safeguards were redesigned not to erase loss, but to localize it. Systems were allowed to bend visibly instead of snapping invisibly. Volatility returned in controlled doses, restoring feedback the city had silenced. Stability became dynamic rather than rigid. Participants adjusted slowly. Confidence became conditional again. Exposure was reduced not because rules demanded it, but because uncertainty was once more allowed to speak. Diversity of strategy returned as shared assumptions weakened. London absorbed a lasting lesson. Stability is not the absence of failure. It is the ability to survive it repeatedly. When calm is enforced too perfectly, fragility accumulates unnoticed. When pressure is released gradually, systems endure. The city moved forward with a deeper respect for imbalance. It learned that resilience requires room for things to go wrong, early, often, and without apology. The lesson was structural, not philosophical. Systems that permit visible failure develop the adaptive capacity to survive invisible threats, while systems that suppress all failure lose the ability to distinguish between stability and stagnation. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future.